And today we have Brandon Delvo, who will be presenting post-traumatic stress disorder and the Frontier Army. And I saw it this month, and then Brandon also, he realized that this is Mental Health Month. So without realizing it, this was a great topic to have today. So on that note, I am going to turn that over to Brandon. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Yvette.
You're welcome.
So thanks for coming out this afternoon to the Confluence Center. And like Yvette said, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I'm going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and the Frontier Army, which is something that really isn't widely talked about in a lot of ways. You kind of hear more about, these big battles and tactics and generals and, acts of heroism, acts of cowardice, all those things that kind of pertain to the American West. But something that really doesn't get talked about is a little more of the humanistic side of things. So just kind of as a disclaimer in here, you're going to be hearing some primary sources from some of the individuals that actually lived through some of these battles themselves. You're going to hear testimony that's going to be really reflective of that time. You're going to hear some language and things like that that might be a little bit disparaging. But we got to remind ourselves that these are being taken from the individuals that lived through these events. And it's also reflective of the times that they lived in. So I think that's really worthy of note to take into account. So some things that we're going to kind of focus on is post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly known as PTSD. And there's going to be a focus on the Frontier Army between 1866 and 1890 and the impact that PTSD had on those soldiers. But it's kind of hard to, talk about PTSD, which is a more modern term, which I'll get into later, without really kind of rewinding back even way, way prior to the post-Civil War era, or the Indian Wars, as they're more commonly called. We have to kind of go back in time to Herodotus, one of the more well-noted, maybe really one of the first historians out there. And there's a tale about Aeschylus, who was a spearman during the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. And it's quoted through Herodotus that he was deprived of his sight in his eyes from receiving a blow and not being received by a blow in any part of the body. But essentially what I think he's talking about is a hysterical blindness. We got to remember that this is a time in warfare where warfare is very personal. He's a spearman, so he's actively face-to-face with his enemies for prolonged periods of time fighting in these battles. So we kind of move ahead a little bit further. We've probably always heard about Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, very well-known story, has its versions of heroism, cowardice, romance, but really in essence, Odysseus, it's his 10-year journey home. And if you know what you're looking for in some of the writing, you can kind of see some symptoms there of post-trauma in, he has to hide his identity in order to survive to get home. He feels emotionless and blank to his wife's feelings and emotions when he gets home. He mistrusts those around him, and he's uncomfortable in crowds. These are all very common symptoms with post-war trauma. We way fast forward into the Napoleonic Wars, and there's something called cerebrospinal shock, is what they called it back then. And it's basically soldiers felt on both sides a tingling, twitching, and partial paralysis from high-velocity projectiles flying by them. This isn't being hit by a cannonball or a musket ball. It's just the feeling of that type of warfare. And then I put down at the bottom an account of a Highlander at Waterloo. There's an account of a Highlander who was at Waterloo at La Haye-Sainte, which is one of the French farms that was being defended by Wellington and the British. And he has an account of the battle went on for so long that day, even though the battle took place later in the day. But at one point, the French soldiers, the bodies started stacking up like cordwood, and they had to push them off to the side to keep their fields of fire open. So just prolonged exposure to just constant trauma and constant combat eventually takes its toll. Then we go up into the Civil War. We get terms known as soldier's heart, or feeling insanity is a common medical term that is used at the time. And some symptoms are chest pains, fatigue, headache, dizziness, diarrhea, and sleep disturbance. We have to remember that, these battles, the tactics are really no different than Napoleonic times. Obviously, the technology has changed. We're going from smoothbore muskets to rifled muskets, so the distance that soldiers are engaging at is a lot farther, but the trauma is still the same. And one thing to note through some of this, I got 2 more slides on some other conflicts here, is that while all this is going on, medical technology, modern medicine, as young as it still is progressing. We're starting to recognize patterns here, and we're starting to find ways that we deal with this type of trauma. So we get into World War I. Shell shock is a very, very common phrase that comes up, or combat stress reaction. Some of that is a little more maybe on those replacements that were coming into these units just from the mass casualties, and some of those replacements feeling unwelcome in units, and having a feeling that they're just a number, they're cannon fodder, and they're just being sent in essentially to the slaughter. But shell shock, kind of going back to that, is more of an exposure, what doctors claimed at this time, to bomb and mortar shell explosions or shell concussions. And their claim was that shell shock caused brain concussions or imbalances in the brain that were causing these soldiers to have the twitching, the shaking, and all those various symptoms. Then we get up into World War II. We start to hear phrases, maybe not so much shell shock anymore, but combat fatigue. Well-known account, General Patton slaps a soldier in Sicily. The soldier claims that he had combat fatigue from prolonged exposure on the front line. And some of those conditions were, there's always a constant threat or danger. Primitive living conditions, that could be living in bombed out buildings. A lot of soldiers are living in foxholes at this point in time, or fighting positions. Prolonged hunger and thirst. The Marines fighting on Peleliu in 1944, they have a lack of water. They just, due to a logistical error, there was no water when they were making that assault. That has a tremendous effect on your ability to perform in a combat zone. Intense fear and great boredom. I like to call it the 90-10 rule. 90% boredom, 10% combat, just fear, having that fight or flight instinct being thrust upon you. Grief from loss of comrades. This is across the board. It can even go back into Civil War times where, regiments and military organizations are formed from local municipalities. So you're seeing individuals that you grew up with die, but you start to see the military unit really become more cohesive by World War II. So grief from loss of comrades really hits home. You think of the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. There's just constant carnage, and the attrition rate is so high that it's really taking a toll on soldiers on the battlefield. And then military unrest in units. That could be everything from a lot of replacements. Maybe some of the command echelon is killed off. Rotational things like that is very, very common. But really, in essence, we're here to talk about the Frontier Army. And just a little bit of an overview. Some things I'm going to kind of focus on. There's really like 4 categories within the Indian Wars time period. So we're looking at like Red Cloud's War, which is right around the late 1860s. That takes place more in north central Wyoming, the Bozeman Trail, Fort Phil Kearny, things like that getting established and built to protect movement on the Bozeman Trail. Little Bighorn, pretty big capstone milestone event. That's one part of that 1876, the Great Sioux War that takes place. And then we get into the Apache Wars of the 1880s that are taking place down in Arizona. Crooks moving against Geronimo and the Chiricahuas. And then we get into kind of that final chapter with Wounded Knee in 1890. So really, just kind of gathering from everything that we'd already talked about from some of those past historical time periods involving the military and trauma. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? I'm not going to read all that verbatim, but some of the things that are more common with what we know today: intrusive thoughts. People with PTSD experience distressing and intrusive memories of that traumatic event. Avoidance. Individuals with PTSD, they try to avoid those reminders or those triggers. That could be sight, smell, you name it. Negative changes in thoughts and mood. That could be everything from just stimuli, the world around you. I don't like big crowds, things of that nature. Hyperarousal and reactivity. So always feeling like you're back to that same feeling of being on point when you were going through that traumatic event. One thing to note with this too, I know this pertains more on the military side, but you don't have to have been in combat or have been a soldier to have post-traumatic stress disorder. You could have been in a car accident. You could have a survivor of domestic abuse. It could be, just the loss of a family member. I mean, the key word in here is traumatic, is trauma. Trauma covers a really wide array of situations and scenarios. One thing we got to kind of get into, I know we talked about kind of that evolution of combat and some of those other time periods. The Indian Wars is really, really different coming out of the Civil War, where you had big armies being raised, big battles, lines of troops, columns, files, you name it. Indian Wars combat is very, very different. And on top of combat, we're also dealing with different geography. We're dealing with different weather. We're not out in Virginia. We're not out in Maryland anymore. We're out on the plains. We're down in the Southwest. You have extreme heat. You have extreme cold. And you're also fighting an adversary who doesn't get in columns or files and fight you. Guerrilla tactics is kind of the key to the day. And we have an army that is essentially trying to adjust to that change in warfare, on top of a Congress that isn't allocating a lot of money anymore for defense. The army is scaled back. You have an army that's using equipment that isn't suited for the extremes of the plains or the Southwest. I mean, you name it. So you're seeing a lot of challenges being thrust upon the Army in the post-Civil War years. And like I said, some of the combat that is taking place is hit and run brushes and skirmishes. Prime example, in the early years of Fort Buford, around 1866, 1867, those simple things like cutting hay, cutting wood, hunting, you have to go out in force to meet your basic needs to just survive as a human being out here. Well, that takes a toll on you mentally. It takes a toll on you physically, having to go out in force just to do these simple things. But if an element going out to cut hay, or hunting, as you can look from the internment records, if there wasn't enough of a show of force, they were a target of opportunity for their adversaries, meaning the Indians. So they do these hit and run brushes, these guerrilla tactics. They were quick, they were fierce, which can cause a lot of trauma early on. Casualties are usually light, and I'm meaning that in comparison to like Civil War battles and things like that. But your short range firing is somewhat limited. You have an enemy that likes to get up and close and personal with you, where you don't have time to see them coming or react. And you have an enemy that's using the terrain. They've lived out here for hundreds and hundreds of years. They use that terrain to their advantage. So we'll kind of get into some primary source accounts here of some of those 4 time periods I talked about, and kind of hearing from those individuals that lived through these events. So we have Timothy O'Brien, who is with Company E of the 18th U.S. Infantry. This is during after the Fetterman tragedy in 1866. So kind of the Fetterman scenario in a really quick nutshell is a gentleman by the name of Captain Fetterman goes up over a hill kind of against orders, gets hit by a larger force of Indians, and meets his demise along with about 80 other soldiers. But what Timothy O'Brien here talks about is the wagons were ordered to advance to rescue the bodies of the dead. We took up the mangled bodies of our comrades, all of whom have been scalped by the Indians, save one man, Private Frank P. Sullivan, company clerk. For some reason, the Indians had spread a buffalo robe over his head. That might be able to indicate that maybe Private Sullivan fought heroically. The Indians might have seen that. Therefore, they didn't mangle him or disturb his body in any way. This right here is somebody who maybe wasn't there in the act of fighting or was there early on, but is having to go now and recover bodies and handling bodies and having prolonged experience to a post-battle scenario can really start to take a toll on you. And that's everything from sights, smells, I mean, you name it across the board. We kind of go in, I got 2 slides here on the Great Sioux War because one fascinating battle that really doesn't get talked all that much is the Battle of the Rosebud, which happens a week before the Little Bighorn. For those that might not be as familiar, the Great Sioux War, you kind of have 3 big columns converging in on south central Montana. You have Colonel Gibbon coming in kind of from near present-day Bozeman, coming in from the west. Custer and the 7th Cavalry, they're coming across the plains from Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck. And then you have Crook. General Crook is coming up from south central Wyoming, or actually, well, central Wyoming, essentially. But what's fascinating about the Battle of the Rosebud is it's what's typically called a running battle. They make contact, and then the battle just kind of evolves over throughout the time period of that day. Really miraculous soldiering. I won't get into a lot of that. But Lieutenant Foster kind of gives an account. I mean, these guys are obviously, and I think the print in here really gives a good description of just how close these individuals are to their adversaries and how quick this happens. I mean, Crook is an avid card player, loves playing cards. He's laying down in a bed of grass playing whist when they start to hear some shots popping off to the north. And all of a sudden the scouts come running in that pretty much the whole Sioux Nation is right on their tail. You have gentlemen that are going from that boredom thing we talked about, that 90-10 rule, now essentially having to go into instant fight or flight response. They're relying on what maybe little training they might have had, and they're having to now react and get the orders from their officers. Officers are now having to suddenly, I got to get into leadership mode. I need to start getting my guys in line so we can survive through this scenario. So Lieutenant Foster, is describing the yip, hi-ya, hi-ya, as the Indians dashed at the line at a gallop. The skirmishers gave back a few paces, but instantly returning poured a withering volley into the rascals, repulsing them with considerable loss. The horses were about 100 yards farther back in a ravine, and the enemy, getting on the right flank, poured an enfilading fire into the troops and threatened the safety of the animals. And he further goes on to describe that the fighting was like the whir of a threshing machine in full operation. What's technically taking place here is, in order for these troopers and that mounted infantry that was there at the Rosebud, those mules or those horses are your lifeline. They're as soon as you get into trouble, you're using those things to get out of trouble. Well, the Indians are essentially found a way to flank them, and now they're starting to hit the gentlemen. Every 4th trooper is taking a group of horses back with them. Well, just imagine the feeling of knowing that your basic mode of transportation on the battlefield is being threatened, while you're also trying to fight your way and survive yourself, and maybe you're starting to pull back towards those horses. It can lead to a lot of different things running through your head that day, on top of just trying to survive and knowing that your horse and your rifle are the 2 things that are going to keep you alive throughout that day. Captain Guy Henry with the 3rd U.S. Cavalry further goes, the death script was upon every man's throat. It just tells you kind of the quick, the fast, and the ferociousness of the fighting. And knowing that some of these troopers were outnumbered, and they knew it, but they had to rely on each other to get through it. And you're hearing from officers. I mean, this is running through officers' minds. Imagine what's going on through that common private who might be an immigrant from Germany, who's now with the 3rd U.S. Cavalry, and they're up defending a hill out in the middle of nowhere, Montana, or present-day Montana, trying to survive. I mean, there's a lot of things that are running through your mind. And then, of course, we get into the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And really a word that you'll hear come up here further down the line is internecine violence. Battle of Gettysburg, internecine violence. You're seeing mutual destruction on both sides. Little Bighorn is really one of those big capstone battles, campaigns of the Indian Wars era, where you're really seeing troopers going up against, an adversary that's going to stick and fight it out. Same thing even goes with the Rosebud. I mean, they sat there for that whole day and they stuck it out, and they pitched back and forth. But you see from William Nugent, who's with Troop A, 7th U.S. Cavalry, I saw others cut and maimed in ways that I could not care to name in private, much less in print. I see no good reason for smoothing the horrible details of the deeds of the bloodthirsty savages that the boys of the old Indian Wars had to meet in the most unequal manner that soldiers ever had to meet in this country or any other. I'll get into some further things with the 7th Cavalry because they're a pretty good snapshot of an Indian Wars unit, and that's something I take into here in these further slides with post-traumatic stress. We have the Nez Perce War. That was the other one I forgot to mention earlier. We have the Nez Perce War. 1877, the Battle of the Big Hole out in southwest Montana. Sergeant Charles Loynes, Company I of the 7th U.S. Infantry states, "We will never forget that day, how we fought with those savages, kill or be killed, no time to load our rifles. With the butts and muzzles of our guns, we struck right and left. The shouts of soldiers, the war whoops of the Indians, the screeching of the squaws, who with Winchesters in their hands were as much to be feared as the bucks." So it's just a further reiteration of just the ferocity of some of these battles that were happening. I won't read this whole one. This is taken from the Apache Wars. This is a Sylvester Grover, Troop C, 4th U.S. Cavalry, actually from this scenario, which essentially is he gets ambushed, him and another trooper. It happens really quickly. He doesn't even realize until after he's wounded and he's dragging himself out of the area by himself that his partner that was next to him was actually killed. So he's trying to fight this out by himself. He actually gets essentially a certificate of merit from the president due to his actions because he still kept the dispatches. He went and recovered them, kept them, fought it out, and still tried to complete his mission, which is really miraculous in itself. But some things that you gather from there is just, I mean, he was fighting for his life, and there's no worse feeling than being by yourself and trying to fight something out, especially maybe against a foe. He doesn't really state it here, but I have a feeling that his foe probably had him outnumbered 3-1 easily. Then we get into 1890. We get Wounded Knee. I won't get into a lot of the details with Wounded Knee, whether who started what or how the whole events around Wounded Knee really transpired. But what I find telling with Andrew Flynn, who I put kind of medic in parentheses, maybe he was, it says in Jerome Green's book that he was a medic, maybe like a surgeon's mate, something like that. Maybe it was helping doctors in some capacity, which was common. But this is a really telling quote where this really starts to tug at your moral compass. And it basically states, as we did not have much room, we had to load up the dead and put the wounded on top of them, basically meaning a wagon, having to load them out of there. So you have dead and wounded all thrown into a wagon, just like cordwood. Just as I was looking over the field, I came across a dead squaw and a little papoose who was sucking on a piece of hardtack. I picked up the little papoose and carried it in my arms. A little way further on, I found a dead squaw and another papoose. I picked it up too and brought them over to the hospital tent where there were a number of Indian women. So you're seeing a gentleman who has a moral compass to see that there's children on this battlefield that had taken place. He's trying to care for them, but then you have troopers that are having to load dead and wounded together. Those are two things that should never mix. That's a real big gut wrencher, and that really tugs at your moral compass. Anybody would state that across the board. So with a lot of this, you're hearing accounts of essentially traumatic experiences. Those gentlemen might not have stated that maybe 20, 30 years down the line, but if you know what you're looking at, you're picking apart things. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier on is I did 2 deployments in Iraq in 2004 and then 2008. So I definitely look at some of this more with a lens of being put in some of those types of situations myself. But you have essentially, we're talking about modern medicine evolving, and modern medicine is still in its infancy, really, when you think of it through the spectrum of military history and such. But with that lack of understanding and treatment, I put in here this is actually essentially almost a success story in its own way, which is very, very, very rare. I'm going to be citing some things here in these next slides there's a book out there called Health of the 7th Cavalry, which essentially 2 medical professionals went into the medical journals and everything, and they picked apart the 7th Cavalry from everything from guys having phlegmy coughs and allergies to, there's a segment in there on post-traumatic stress disorder. And they look at it really through a lens that is just phenomenal. I mean, mind you, we're looking at this with the lens we have today. Those doctors and those professionals back then didn't have that luxury that we have. But you have an account of Private John J. Fay, who was with Troop D, 7th Cavalry. June 21st, 1877, we're getting close to around that 1-year anniversary of the battle. John Fay, essentially, from the account, he just goes and talks to the surgeon. He's already out on campaign and field operations. He goes up to the surgeon and pretty much in a nutshell says, I can't do this anymore. I can't do it. And the surgeon diagnoses him with insanity, which could be everything from mania, agitation, melancholia, dementia. And to be of note, he's a veteran of the Valley fight. So early on in the battle with Reno, and then the Hilltop defense, which in its own right stands by itself, because the 7th Cavalry, by the time of the Hilltop defense, they'd already been licked, and they're having to just fight it out and survive and wait for reinforcements. So you're dealing with a lot of that emotion and everything else from that day on the Little Bighorn. But he was uninjured. He wasn't shot. He wasn't stabbed. He had no physical injuries to him from his time at the Little Bighorn, except that it's noted that intrusive re-experiencing of the battle, or he was trying to avoid it itself up until it comes up around that anniversary time frame. So the surgeon essentially transfers him, gets him out of there, which is really rare in itself, because the 7th Cavalry, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, they didn't do that. They took him to the cantonment back up at Powder River, and the Book of Terrible Glory, James Donovan has some good accounts of, they just sat there with nothing to do and copious amounts of alcohol. That leads to a whole problem in and of itself. But the fact that the surgeon gets Fay off the line, off of operations, and then they start to see where he's getting transferred, he gets sent back to the nearest supply depot, makes it back to Fort Lincoln, and then by September, so you only have a matter of months between June and September, he gets discharged at Fort Rice. Somehow throughout life, I mean, we don't really know all the details of where he went after his discharge. A lot of these individuals, they might have, hung around Bismarck, maybe the nearest settlement, but they do note that by 1880, he's married, he has 3 children, and he's living near Fort Meade. Around that time, the 7th Cavalry is down by Fort Meade. So he still has some connection of some sort, whether he knows it or not, to where soldiers are, where they're stationed. But then he dies day after Christmas, Christmas Day in 1932 at the 80 years old soldiers home, Washington, D.C., and there's nothing else to know in his post-service world that he'd been in jail, drunkenness, fighting, nothing like that. So it's kind of an oddity, but that's from a documented side. I mean, we can't, and I'm not going to try to speculate whether he had nightmares or not. I can guarantee you he probably had everything going with it. But the basic nuts and bolts is that this guy went up either maybe to his chain of command or the surgeon and said, I can't do this anymore. And I've already done my time and I fought this out. And they transfer him out of there. It's a rarity in and of itself. But unfortunately, this is just one guy in a bigger pie of people that unfortunately didn't have this luxury. There's thousands and thousands of those that were in the Indian Wars, Frontier Army, that never got this benefit. And I use kind of this slide here too, the image in it, which is a famous picture from I believe the 1874 Black Hills expedition. The gentleman in the back with the kind of the frazzled hat is John Berkman. John Berkman was Custer's striker, basically his personal orderly, his assistant. Berkman idolized Custer. I mean, worshiped the ground he walked on. At the Bighorn, he gets detailed with the pack train. Doesn't get to go with Custer and ride into glory or the demise of Custer's command. Lives with Berkman up until he decides to take his own life and die by suicide, I believe in 1925, and he states in some of his final words that he left that he wished he could have been there with Custer on that day. So I have a success story, and then, I have a picture with a gentleman who's a statistic. And this is very common, which you'll see in some of these other slides here. So some of the conditions that we're going to look at, some of this is kind of from an that is a tongue twister. An epidemiological approach. So we're looking at the 7th Cavalry as a whole. We're not looking at one troop or anything else. You have mass medical records that are out there. These doctors, I mean, you know, we know Dr. Washington Matthews up here at Buford. He's documenting the weather every day. He's documenting the wind direction. These are very, very detailed individuals. Another cool thing to look at is like the barracks and hospitals report from like 1870. Very, very detailed on how they take into account the post and the conditions. So these are gentlemen that are pretty articulate individuals in their medical records. But we're basing some of these conclusions off of what we know today about post-traumatic stress. So we're looking at it through a different lens. Those that were before us, they didn't get that luxury. And we're looking at this based on some symptoms before and after some of the major campaigns that are going on. And your conditions before a campaign is a little bit of your baseline. So, you know, guys are in garrison environments, doing their thing. We're not out in the field. We're not having any of that exposure to potential battle conditions or anything like that. So your baseline is just the average rigmarole of military daily life. Then we look at conditions after a battle, where typically you're probably going to see those traumatic experiences and some of those reactions and symptoms really start to take place. And then you have some of your heightened PTSD up to a year after the event. You know, I reference John Fay again. I mean, he was still having heightened PTSD, and knowing that the anniversary was coming up, was still suffering from some of those symptoms. So some of the effects on PTSD on Frontier Army soldiers, we obviously have combat wounds, and I mentioned before, like internecine violence. These combat wounds are due essentially to tactics, moving, timing on the battlefield. This isn't meant by wounds that an individual does to himself in any capacity. These are essentially combat wounds, being wounded in action, as we call it today. Alcohol, inebriation, alcoholism, delirium, very, very common thing, and alcohol is very much available to the Frontier Army at this time. It's noted while the 7th Cavalry's going to the Little Bighorn at Powder River Depot, I mean, they had ample amounts of alcohol on hand. So there's ways that you're starting to see soldiers cope with things. Suicide. One individual in the 7th Cavalry after the Little Bighorn actually dies by an opium overdose. You know, probably didn't want to take the way out of like using a pistol or anything else, but essentially wanted to put himself to sleep to probably rid himself of the nightmares is some conclusions I kind of came to from looking at it. And then you have avoidance of events. Desertion is very, very common. You look in the book on Health of the 7th Cavalry, they seemed a little skeptical as to, they looked at it from kind of more of the major campaigns that the 7th was involved in, why there was no desertion around like the time of the Battle of the Washita. Well, that took place in the wintertime. You know, is a soldier going to desert in March in North Dakota? Probably not. Is he going to desert in July? Probably. The conditions are a little more favorable for them to move on the ground and get out of whatever they want to get out of. So, but desertion is a very common thing. You just have individuals say, I give up, I'm out of here, I'm done. And this is a point in time where you didn't have driver's license, social security cards. You have soldiers enlisting and deserting, taking up multiple different names throughout a time period. So desertion is a very, very common thing. We get into some of the coping mechanisms and some of the resilience that some of the individuals had at the time. You know, you essentially, the military unit itself, whether you're in garrison or whether you're on the battlefield, it's a family in its own way. I mean, I'm not going to get into, you know, like politics of the 7th Cavalry or politics of other units. I mean, you know, it's human nature. Those things happen within a military unit. But you even look at like the Sanford Diary. You see names come up time and again from Sanford's time. I mean, those were individuals that he bunked with. He went on patrols with. They become a family. You make lifelong friendships in the military. And I kind of you rely on each other for support. Whether you're on the hilltop defense at Little Bighorn, where it's you and the guy next to you just trying to survive that day, or you're out on a woodcutting detail coming out of Fort Buford, you know, you're relying on each other to get those basic tasks done, or you're relying on yourself and your your comrades to survive on the battlefield. So very, very common. Some resilience things. I mean, why did maybe some people not desert? Economic conditions. I mean, the post-war era, you have, the economic panic of 1873. There's other things going on. Essentially, the Army is 3 hots and a cot. You have a roof over your head. You're clothed. A lot of your basic needs are being met. So some individuals just stick it out. They stick with it, or they find other individuals. It's very common in military units for veterans to really hang out more with veterans, people that have experienced these things. So you find a family and a brotherhood in your own right, and a way to cope with that amongst each other. Some of it's stigma. I don't want to let my bunkie next to me down. If I leave, or if I go and report something to the surgeon, now I look like a coward in the face of my comrades. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to find other ways to handle this. But you also start to see, after the Civil War, and then really after the Indian Wars, you start to see these veteran organizations come up and really come into play. With the Civil War, I mentioned here GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization. You get the Society of Veterans of Indian Wars that eventually evolves more into the Order of Indian Wars, and it exists for over 50 years. You start to see these places where these veterans can really come together. They're sharing stories, they're remembering their times, whether they're out in the plains or down in the Southwest. And it's a way for them to really bond and know that they've shared a common experience. That's still very prevalent today with your VFWs, your American Legions, your Disabled American Veterans. Those are all places where it didn't matter if somebody fought in Korea or fought in Vietnam. Warfare was warfare. We share a common bond through that. So we have a lot more of a modern understanding, and I cut off those earlier slides at World War II, and I did that kind of for a reason, because PTSD was officially titled and recognized medically in 1980. So it's not even a half-century year old that this is, it's officially now on the books as being titled as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Vietnam War and everything, I mean, by 1980, the Vietnam War was still fresh in people's minds. Your official end date for the Vietnam War is 1975. So, I mean, we were really starting to get a grasp on this and tackle it a lot better. You had, Gulf War syndrome was another thing that those through the first Gulf War suffered from. But what really blew the door open was the global war on terror. We've had over 3 million veterans serve in the war on terrorism. I mean, so we had a massive influx of veterans. I was one of those veterans that came home in 2005, and there was not a lot of care on hand. It was essentially filling out a form, which probably was no different, and probably is why I relate really well to the soldiers of the Frontier Army days of, did you see X, Y, and Z? There was that stigma, like I mentioned before. Don't sign it. You don't want to be held up by the doctors. You get released back into society. Well, then things start happening after that. And I can attest to, and I know experiences vary with a lot of veterans out there. I personally feel, and this is just my opinion, that between Montana and North Dakota, we really have some of the best VA care centers in the country. And with the help of the VA and our vet centers, like I said, experiences vary. I get that with some individuals. But our vet centers and our VA and then our local veteran organizations are really tackling this at a local level. Whether it's just constant reminding of that resources are on hand locally. It could be things like Mental Health Awareness Month, putting information out about that. When I worked at Farmers Union, we had something called bootstrap cards on handling farm stress, feeling that weight of just all the economic conditions on farmers, on top of drought years, what it was taking, a toll on them. We were giving out information at meetings, and they were like business card size information. You just hand it to somebody, they have it on hand. But then we're adjusting with telehealth, texting. You don't have to just go into a doctor's office. Going back to that stigma, I mean, those of us that have lived in small towns, I mean, why is Bob's truck out in front of the church on a Tuesday? It's not Bible study day. It's not quilting day. Or why is Janice's truck there? That's not quilting day. Well, Janice is probably maybe talking to her clergy because she's maybe having problems, So telehealth and texting, ways of getting it into the home that is more comfortable for individuals, is really helpful. And the VA really tackled this, and I'm one of those people that have used telehealth resources to the VA for a long period of time. So it's good to see that we are starting to, from everything that you'd seen in these previous slides, really start to tackle a lot of this. So kind of just a conclusion to wrap some of this up. We talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked about some of the signs and symptoms of it. A reminder, you don't have to have been in some high-pitched battle, whether it's Normandy, Little Bighorn, to have PTSD. Like I said before, it could be from an accident, domestic abuse, emotional trauma. It covers a wide array, and the key word in there is traumatic, because that covers a wide swath of events and scenarios and variables. We talked about PTSD and its focus on the Frontier Army. A lot of what those soldiers dealt with, based, kind of giving you an understanding through some of those primary source accounts. And then challenges of PTSD on the Frontier Army soldiers. Talked about, their use of alcohol. There was suicide, moments of violence, maybe amongst soldiers, maybe right after the event or months later. And then addressing mental health in historical context. I think we've covered that pretty well. Just kind of as warfare shifted, the way that we as human beings started to tackle this from a mental health perspective shifted. And really how we're tackling it today with our vet centers and our telehealth and our texting, our national mental health texting number, just things like that. So, and with that, I'll just leave it up to any questions. All right. Well, thank you, Yvette. Thanks for having me. And yeah, for Mental Health Awareness Month, I thought this was a really good topic that maybe isn't covered as well, or as widely known, I guess I should say. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I will say that studying history and reading the books and such, it brings a different view of how to look at things, not only from a man that went through it, but how it related to the women at that time. Like the women who were at Fort Abraham Lincoln, when they got word of the demise of all of their men, what they encountered and what they went through. And we don't always think about that today.
No.
I mean, so it really opens up, I get goosebumps. It really opens up things in a different way, and things to be aware of that they didn't have then. So yeah, so without realizing, what a great topic for the month. So yes.
That could be something even for next year of how women on posts, laundresses and military status.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
You even, can empathize even with Libby Custer. I mean, you said, when they found out, well, the Army was pretty quick to kick him out of the officers' quarters because Libby didn't have military status
anymore. Yep.
Those laundresses had more status than an officer's wife.
Exactly.
But therefore, Libby was of no use to the War Department anymore because her spouse was deceased. So that's a very good point, maybe as a topic for next year, of how women on these posts handled everything that was going on around them, whether they could control it or not.
Definitely something to look into, because laundresses still remained on the post because of that contract that they signed, the enlistment, and they just continued on because they had to. But how did it affect them? And the wives. I mean, and Libby, she pushed for help for wives and the men who died, and getting better benefits after they passed.
Absolutely.
So definitely, like I said, that definitely opens up a whole nother view of things. So, so thank you everybody for coming today, and I thank you on behalf of the State Historical Society. So thank you, and have a great day, and come to our next program. So thank you. Yep.
What is your next program?
So and I guess I could say, even if there were a lot of people here, I think that people would have been thinking